you like to follow along, please turn in to Acts chapter 16. And there's some laying around here, if Katie would need one. You do or you don't? Okay, all right. The book of Acts, at least for me, is, I don't like to use this word, but I'm gonna. I think it's a very entertaining book to read because there's so much going on. I mean, after all, it is the acts, the action. There's a lot of action. And every bit of the narrative quality, every bit of the narrative segments, each one of them, as we come to them, they're all just so different. So much is going on. So many things are changing. And here we're going to come to a place where Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke come to a specific moment in their travels. And they're going to do something that's kind of strange in a way. Paul's already been on a missionary journey. Now they're going to go back and visit churches where they've already been, where they've already been planted. But instead of going where they intend to go, God is going to change their minds about what it is they're going to do and what they're going to do. I wish, and I say this totally honestly, I wish I had greater clarity about what God wants in my day-to-day living as I go through the moments of life. What would you have me do? Even when I wake up first thing in the morning, what will today be? What things will you bring into my life, Lord, that I should act upon? I wish I had greater clarity about that. But one thing's for sure, God does show us things in our lives. It's just a lot of the time we're just not alert enough to see them as they come. Let's take a look at this text and see what happens to these four. Acts chapter 16, verse 1. Paul also came to Derbe and Lystra, and a disciple named Timothy was there, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but Timothy's father was a Greek. The brothers in Lystra and Iconium spoke well of Timothy. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, so he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that Timothy's father was a Greek. As they went through the towns, they passed on the decrees that had been decided by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem at the Council of Jerusalem for the Gentile believers in those churches to obey. So the churches were being strengthened in the faith and were increasing in number every day. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been prevented by the Holy Spirit from speaking the message in the provinces of Asia. When they came to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to enter there. So they passed through Mysia and went down to Troas. A vision appeared to Paul in the night. A Macedonian man was standing there urging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul saw the vision, we attempted immediately to go over to Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. So we put out to sea from Troas and sailed a straight course to Samothrake, the next day to Neapolis. From there to Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia, a Roman colony. We stayed in this city for some days, and on the Sabbath days we went outside the city gate to the side of the river where we thought there would be a place of prayer. We sat down and we began to speak to some of the women who had assembled there. A woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, a God-fearing woman, listened to us, and the Lord opened her heart to respond to what Paul was saying. After she and her household were baptized, she urged us and said, "If you consider me to be a believer in the Lord, come and stay in my house." And she persuaded us to do so. Paul and Silas are following a vision that's been given to Paul. And this vision, in some respects, means that you see how many times in this one little text they've been changed in terms of what they had intended to do to what they wind up doing. And this is so critical to me. I can't speak for anybody else in the room. But as I look around at life in the way that God has structured life to be in my world, there are things that I look at in terms of the categories of success and failure in nearly everything I do and every day. The way I think, the way I think about my life with God. I look at it and say, am I failing? Am I succeeding here? And I don't think there's a lot of neutral ground in there at all. But sometimes the very things that we think our failures are actually God doing something to move us into a place that he would have us be. They wind up, after all these changes, in Philippi. Philippi is an interesting city in Greece, in what would be called Greek, a Greek city at that time. It's actually named after Alexander the Great's father, Philip of Macedonia. He actually founded the city. They also speak about the fact as they sailed out of Troas, if you get a map of this area, you'll see this island, Samothrake, sitting out in the middle of the Aegean Sea between two mainland places, between Troas and Neapolis, where they sailed and put in once they'd gotten to the mainland. Samothrake is an interesting place. They dug up a sculpture there called the Winged Nike. I don't know how many of you are interested in old cars. I kind of like cars. So old cars, old Chryslers used to have this winged thing on the hood, way up on the hood ornament. Well, that's called the Winged Nike. It's a Greek goddess, and this particular sculpture they think was crafted prior to the 1st century. They dug it up on Samothrake, and it sits in a museum right now. It's about 9 feet tall. It's a huge thing, wherein you've got this winged Nike sitting on the prow of a stone representation of the prow of a boat. This place, what fascinates me about this is that you see these cities named all through the book of the Acts. And all of these cities, even down to the point of some of the people who are in charge in these cities, their names have shown up archaeologically. That we know this person actually was right there in the 1st century that's named by Luke in this part of the world, and we dig up something and there's their name carved into a piece of stone that we can say this person was really there. There are about 54 cities that Luke names, and every one of them has been uncovered, discovered, and shown archaeologically to actually be a city. Pretty amazing. Philippi was an ancient city founded around 356 BC by Alexander's father, Philip of Macedonia. That's where it gets its name. And it was taken over by the Romans in the 160s BC. It's a Roman colony, as the text says. That's a very specific term. What it means is it was set apart by the Romans in terms of its being a province. A colony meant when you lived there, you didn't have to pay Roman taxes. So it was a very popular place for people to live, kind of like Texas, Nevada, and other places where people are leaving California to try to go live in these other places where the taxes are more favorable. And a lot of Roman soldiers would retire to Philippi. And this made the population very cosmopolitan. Lots of different kinds of people lived there. And so you've got Lydia, who's a Greek woman, but she's also a believer. She's a Jewish, what would be called a Jewish proselyte. She's a Greek woman who has believed the message of Judaism, and so she's what's known as a God-fearer, very much like Cornelius. When Peter went to Cornelius, Cornelius was a God-fearer. She is from the Asian mainland in Thyatira, which is actually her name. Her name is Lydia, but that's what Thyatira used to be called, Lydia, and that's where she's from. She deals in the color purple. Now that's a really confusing kind of thing. What's the big deal about the color purple? In the ancient world, we go to Walmart or Belk's or wherever we go to buy clothing, and you can buy any color shirt or pants or blouse or socks, all kinds of colors. Everybody in this room is wearing all kinds of colors. Even Katie's shirt has many different colors printed on it. I mean, you can have anything you want. Well, it wasn't that way in the ancient world. And the color purple was one color that was very hard to produce. You got it from a shellfish called a murex. A murex is about 6 to 10 inches long. It looks like a conch with a lot of spines all over it. Just like a squid, it's a mollusk. A squid is a type of mollusk. An octopus is a mollusk. And you notice that when a squid wants to escape an enemy, it squirts out some ink and swims away, leaving a cloud behind. Well, that material, that ink, all mollusks have some form of this. And in the murex, you take that material out of the snail's body and you use it to dye cloth. Very expensive and very time consuming. If you were to take today's dollars and take a bundle of raw wool, 1 pound of raw wool, it costs about $1,200 to dye that 1 pound of wool purple. That's before you make the garment by hand. So you can imagine Only wealthy people wore anything that was colored purple. The priests in the temple had a part of their clothing that was purple. Very expensive. So it was a whole business. You could have a business called the color purple, and you were in business for yourself. Well, that's what Lydia does for a living. And of course, she hears the gospel, and she and her whole household become believers. They believe in Jesus. And it sets up something that I remember when we were traveling, when I was traveling with the two bands I traveled with. This happened to us in Kansas and in California. We would go somewhere, and a family, in the case of California, it was a missionary family, said, why don't you just set up here to come to California and do your concerts, but just stay with us instead of having to worry about all these places where you're going. Because you know, in the West, it's anywhere you drive in the West, it's a long way. I mean, you might drive half a day to get anywhere. Well, so that's what we did. And what an incredible gift to us that was, that we could go 2,900 miles from where we were in Pennsylvania to California and stay with these missionaries and do concerts around their region without having to travel back and across the country to get to them. It was a wonderful thing. That's exactly what Lydia has offered to Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. And from then on, you're going to have this base of operations in a far-flung place, Philippi, where missionary work can be done because there's a headquarters now. We know where we can stay. We can stay at Lydia's when we go that far. So it's a huge thing. Now, why is Lydia in this narrative? Well, Paul's had a vision. And in that vision, what does it say? The man from Macedonia said, come and help us. Come to Philippi and help us. So Paul goes to Philippi, and guess who the man from Macedonia is? Lydia. Lydia. Now think about it for a minute. If God had given Paul a vision, and it had been a woman, Paul probably, given Paul's background as a Jewish Pharisee, probably would not have thought, I guess I need to go to Philippi for the woman from Macedonia. Because for Paul, that would have been strange. So the vision that God gives Paul that sends him to Macedonia is a man. And yet when Paul gets there, the man turns out to be Lydia. Pretty amazing. And it's so significant here. This is exactly the same way that Peter is called. Peter was a good Jewish boy. He knew that he was not supposed to go and enter the house of a Gentile. And even when he gets to Cornelius' house, there's a little bit of a problem there for him when he first arrives. And yet, he's been told by God through his vision that he should call nothing unclean any longer relative to all the foods that came down on the sheet. You remember the vision that he had. But the significant thing is here, they're both open to it. That's so incredible to me. I mean, I guarantee you, Becky hates it when I say that. I guarantee you that there are so many times in my own life where God has given me an impetus to do something, say something, be somewhere, and I have ignored it. Just not alert enough to know it, not capturing the vision, whatever that vision is that God would give. And yet, how many things have I missed because of that? Where I've just not paid attention? I don't know. We were talking about this Wednesday night. There's an element in things like this wherein we're praying. And in prayer, so many times, this is Wednesday a week ago, we become mechanical in our prayer. You know, we've got this list of things that we pray about and for, and it becomes mechanical. It does for me. But you know, when we're praying for something where we're deeply invested, why are we doing that? We're deeply invested because it affects us. That's why. I mean, if I'm praying for somebody I really love to have something change in their life, yes, I want to see that change in their life, but I'm also praying to gain relief from the feeling of wanting to see that change in their life. So there's a lot of me in it. But boy, when we're just praying the list, when we're just praying in that mechanical way, I wonder how much of that is just we're now really out of the way. I mean, it means something that we would bother to pray, that we would close our eyes and believe that God is listening and going to act on behalf of our prayers. That means a lot. The significant person in this group now is a new person, Timothy. He's not been part of their group. Paul, if you go back a couple of chapters, Paul gets stoned in Lystra. And that doesn't mean that Paul had too much to drink. That means that Paul got rocks thrown at him until they killed him. Now, in the text, the city officials, after Paul is stoned in Lystra, they drag him out of the city. There's a good reason for that. They know that in Rome, you're not allowed to execute anybody. Only the Romans could do that. Only the Roman officials could execute anybody. But it happened all the time. I mean, there's no radio, there's no TV, there are no security cameras, so we could stone somebody, and as long as nobody says anything, we can get away with it. So they drag Paul outside the city after he has been stoned. Stoning was not there just to bang you up or punish you a little bit. It was there to kill you. That's what it was for. It was a means of execution. So when they drag Paul out of the city, he's dead. He's dead. And then when they get outside the city, he gets up and goes back to Lystra, where he'd just been stoned to death. Think about what that would mean for young Timothy, who lives in Lystra, to hear that. So, Timothy becomes a disciple. And I'll tell you, you see this element where Paul has these things that happen to him that make him so weak as a human being. But speaking for myself, the times where I've seen God do the best things in me were when I was at my worst. I remember I was doing a sermon in Pennsylvania, and it was a horrible moment for me. If you've never done a sermon, you have no idea what it feels like when all of a sudden you're speaking and you start to hear yourself speaking. You're not thinking about what you're saying, you're thinking about how you sound saying it. Something changes. I don't understand it. I'm not there today. I'm okay right now, but it can happen. And when it happens, it's like pulling teeth to try to get the sermon to mean anything. You look out there and you see people looking back at yourself as you deliver the sermon, and you realize nobody's with you. You know, looking at books or doing whatever. Nobody's there. They might be staring at you, but nobody's home. Well, I did a sermon like that in Pennsylvania. It was just a fight to get through it. And I knew, and every cell in my body said, I cannot wait to finish this so that I can get away from being up front and sit down. I just felt like the sermon was just a mess from top to bottom. I remember the text. It was Joshua. Well, I'm up there a few minutes after the horrid experience of delivering this sermon for me. And I got done, and this guy comes up, and tears are just streaming down his face. He's just crying his eyes out. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? And the guy comes up to me and he says, I'm so thankful you read that passage. That was all that mattered. The whole sermon was just none of that had an effect. What had an effect was I had read a passage of Scripture that had spoken to him in a way that changed his life in such a way that he comes up crying. When we're at our weakest, those are usually the times when God does the most. When we think that we're praying in a rote, mechanical way, do not ever think for a second that God is not moving. God is doing things. And at every segment of this text, you see God doing something. He moves Paul and this group of people into places they never had planned to be. Go back and read chapters 14 and 15 and you'll see it for yourself. Paul is moved to do certain things even though he has a certain plan in mind. He wants to deliver a letter, so he wants to take it back to the churches that are planted. He wants to go to Bithynia, but God says, nuh-uh, you're not going to Bithynia. He has an infirmity. He goes to Galatia to preach on the first mission trip. He's not allowed to go back. But he goes to Galatia to preach, and he says in the text, you would have gouged your eyes out and given them to me if you could. Something's wrong with Paul. But Paul is used in Galatia and all that weakness to change Galatia. He returns to Lystra after he's been stoned to death, and Timothy joins him. Timothy might have never joined them had they not gone back to Lystra. The infirmity then, I see this as God moving, that Paul is infirm. Notice the text. Luke writes in the text, if you read the book of Acts, you'll see they, and then all of a sudden you see we. Because Luke is now traveling with them. Luke is a physician. You think perhaps Paul in his infirmity might have needed Luke from time to time? They get sent to Philippi, and they have this happenstance meeting at the river with the man from Macedonia who turns out to be a woman. And then Lydia is converted, and now there's a place where the missionaries can go as they travel and move out from Philippi to the wider regions of Greece, because Lydia has opened her home now that she's a believer. All of this happens because of what looks like failures in their lives. They plan to do this, and God says no. I look at this and I say, look at the result of it. The result is the gospel spreads in a place that it might never have otherwise. It's kind of like what happens when they're run off the porch. You remember when the church first started? They got onto the temple porch and they're preaching the gospel from the temple steps. And then all of a sudden, the Romans and the Jews get involved and they scatter everybody everywhere. You can't do this anymore. And the church grows because the church gets scattered. There are times when you and I move through this life and we feel an urgency to do something, to say something, to go put our hand on somebody's shoulder. And is there something I can do for you? Is there something I can... We want to do something. We feel that sense of urgency and we don't act. How many times is that sense of urgency God telling us to act? I can speak for myself. I can't tell you how many times I have felt an urgency to act and then had to drive 10 miles to turn back around to go back to do the thing that if I just stopped to begin with, I could have gotten it all taken care of at one time. Don't miss the opportunities where God gives you one. I say that to myself. Anytime I do a sermon up here, don't think I'm saying you. I'm saying me. Rip, don't miss the opportunities that God gives you. You and I are commissioned, all of us are commissioned to continue the book of the Acts. And the book of the Acts, if we'll take it as such, is an encouragement to all of us to pursue God in prayer for those opportunities, and they will come. They will come, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, no matter what it is we're doing. God will use us if we'll allow it.